Okay, earlier I introduced what's known to philosophers as the mind-body problem. And last time we focused upon one aspect of it, the most popular aspect of the mind-body problem, which is how do physical processes in the brain generate conscious experiences in the mind, if you'll pardon the dualism. And I've tried to make the point that we had the foggiest idea how that happens, but that at least we can make some progress on establishing what Chris Koch calls the neural correlates of consciousness by trying to figure out what parts of the brain are involved when people are conscious versus not, or having particular kinds of conscious experiences or not. What I want to do today is to turn to the other three mind-body problems, and I'm going to fly low, so I'd like, really, if it's a really important question or I'm being completely stupid, interrupt me. Otherwise, if you've got questions, please post them to the queries and comments thing, because that's a very good resource. Anyway, the second part of the mind-body problem is kind of captured by a quote not from Ludwig Wittgenstein, but by another Eastern Central European, Sigmund Freud, when he referred to the puzzling leap between the mind and the body, the leap from a mental process to a somatic innovation. Now, that's exactly the opposite of what Wittgenstein was talking about. So how do minds or mental states affect bodily processes? And kind of like Wittgenstein, Freud says, we're never going to figure this out. It can never be fully comprehensible to us. But there is a long tradition in psychology, psychiatry, and medicine in general of people who are trying to work on this various kind of thing. And this is what's known as the general domain of psychosomatic medicine, where a person's physical illness seems to be caused by some kind of mental state. Now, psychosomatics is in bad odor in some parts of medicine these days, and part of the reason for that is that the whole idea of psychosomatic medicine has been tainted by the psychoanalytic legacy that comes to us from Sigmund Freud, whose followers made a number of fairly outrageous and empirically unsupported claims about the psychological basis of certain kinds of physical illnesses. So, for example, Franz Alexander, who was the dean of psychosomatic medicine for the first half of the 20th century, wrote an entire book in which he tried to lay out the unconscious, conflict-laden psychological causes that underlay various kinds of physical illnesses. So, for example, a particular form of eating disorder known as anorexia nervosa, one that may be familiar to you from the press at least, seemed to have been caused, what was caused, Alexander said, by unconscious feelings of envy and jealousy. And peptic ulcers were caused, in his view, by unconscious feelings of infantile dependency, which conflicted with the person's pride and aspiration. Bronchial asthma, for those of you who have that was attributed to excessive unresolved dependence on the mother, and so on and so on. You kind of get the flavor for this. Alexander himself produced this very helpful diagram to show exactly how the whole thing was supposed to operate. We all have infantile dependency as infants. That's almost what it means to be an infant. But for some of us, that kind of gets transformed into adult feelings of pride and guilt and all of that, the reassurance that you're going to be fed. But if there's any kind of conflict about this at all, the infantile dependency then generates inferiority feelings, then generates narcissistic protest, then overcompensation and competitive aggression, anxiety and guilt, and all of that feeds into this whole complex here through the neuroendocrine system to produce a peptic ulcer. Now, there never was any evidence for this kind of formulation. And for that reason, these kinds of formulations were the object of considerable skepticism. However, in modern psychological medicine, we have another formulation which doesn't rely on Freudian concepts of unconscious conflict and the Oedipus complex and castration anxiety and all of that, but simply refers to the effects of stress on the operation of the autonomic nervous system, which has consequences for what goes on inside your stomach. And the general idea behind this is that when an organism, when a person is stressed, he or she invokes what's known as the flight or fight reflex, which activates the two branches of the autonomic nervous system. And if the stressor goes away, everything's fine. The autonomic nervous system eventually comes back to normal. But if you're subjected to prolonged stress, what happens is that the secretion of gastric acid as a result of this prolonged activation of the autonomic nervous system eventually essentially burns a hole in your stomach lining and creates ulcers. Now, that is a kind of garden variety stress-related formulation of where ulcers come from, and it was one that was accepted for many, many years after as a more science-based alternative to the psychoanalytic formulation. This is generally what's known in the trade as the stress-disease connection. And the general idea behind the stress-disease connection is that exposure to chronic stress increases a person's vulnerability to a whole host of different kinds of medical conditions. Increases risk of depression, that seems natural, but also increases risk of cardiovascular disease. There's data that exposure to chronic stress increases the likelihood that HIV infection will progress to AIDS, which it doesn't always do. There is some evidence that some cancers may be related to exposure to chronic stress and so on. All of this evidence is a result of basically naturalistic experiments in which we either identify people who are exposed to chronic levels of stress and then follow their medical conditions longitudinally for a long period of time, or we take people who have a particular disease or particular kind of disease and then look back in their environments to see if we can find evidence of various kinds of chronic stress. This is the usual way in which epidemiology is done. And as I say, first thing to be said about this is the modern psychosomatic formulation. The second thing to be said is that stress is a psychological concept, okay? When stress was originally defined by Walter Buchanan back in the early parts of the 20th century, he really defined it almost physically as a stressor was any stimulus that elicited the flight or fight response from an organism. Stress has now been broadened a little bit, but that was the general idea. Hans Selye, who's probably the most famous writer on stress in the 20th century, began to move away a little bit from the physical and the physiological to define a stressor as any event which challenges the organism's physiological or psychological adaptation to his environment. And finally, Sheldon Cohen at Carnegie Mellon University developed a kind of modern psychological interpretation of stress as the perception that environmental demands exceed a person's current adaptive capacity. Notice that in contrast to Selye and Cannon, that Cohen has defined stress exclusively in psychological terms. It is the perception that the environment is more demanding than you can cope with. Doesn't matter whether the environment is more demanding than you can cope with. It's the perception that counts. So stress, this makes clear that for Cohen at least, stress is a psychological condition, which means that this psychological condition of stress has effects on the body, increasing vulnerability to ulcers or cardiovascular disease or what have you. This is exactly what Freud had in mind, setting aside the intricacies of psychoanalytic theory. This is exactly what Freud had in mind when he talked about the effect of the mental state on a somatic innervation. Okay? Now that's fine, and there's general acceptance of this view, at least among psychologists who do health psychology, people like Berkeley's own Aaron Fisher and others, but it is an idea that has come under the challenge in various kinds of domains. Perhaps the biggest challenge to the modern psychosomatic formulation of stress-related ulcers came from work by two Australian physicians, Warren and Marshall, in the 1980s, who identified a new bacterium, Helicobacter pylori, H. pylori, that they found in the intestines of a huge proportion of patients with various kinds of ulcers. So here, this is data from their original paper. About 90% of patients with ulcers have H. pylori infection. About 50% of patients with inflamed intestines have this infection, as opposed to people who are non-ulcerated, only about 50%. This won Marshall and Warren the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine because they had established the physical cause, so they claimed, of ulcers, something that had bothered people for a very long time, and discovered this new bacterium along the way. It's really, truly wonderful work, but we now understand that its implications are not quite what Warren and Marshall thought they were. Nevertheless, some biologically oriented psychologists, psychiatrists, and other physicians jumped on the Warren and Marshall finding to dismiss the idea that psychological states could have any effect on the body whatsoever, okay? Basically to get rid of the idea of the stress-disease connection. The title of this paper by Ray Hyman, who became the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, dean of the Harvard Medical School, and now the director of the Broad Institute for Medicine in Cambridge, was Another One Bites the Dust, okay? And what Hyman was referring to here was that there was, in his view, a long history of psychological formulations of disease, which every one of them, from time to time, have been undercut by the findings of real science, by the findings of biology. And he said here, the time-honored attribution of ulcers to stress may result from theory-driven retrospective falsification. That is, when ulcers occur, prior stressors are sought and blamed. But the idea here is that ulcers do not have their origin in psychological effects at all. Now, this is an important argument because there are a bunch of people in the mental health community, for example, who are determined to make an argument along the following lines. When we see cases of mental illness in association with changes in brain physiology or brain anatomy or whatever, that shows us that mental illness is real illness, okay? Depression isn't a real mental illness unless you can associate it with neurotransmitter changes or a lesion in some part of the brain or whatever. Schizophrenia isn't a real illness unless you can associate it with something that goes on at the level of the neuron, which leads people to argue that mental illness has a biological basis, always has a biological basis, true mental illness. You can diagnose